Hey everyone, we're going to talk about the effects of the Great Depression today in the urban cities. So, the actual main cause that got the Great Depression going was a day called Black Tuesday when the stock market crashed, which propelled the economy into chaos, not just in the US, but all around the world. So, when the news broke that the stock market was crashing, it got even worse because everyone tried to sell their stocks and get something for the value of these stocks. Something, even though they knew they were going to lose money because it looked like it was all going away. And that's exactly what was happening. Frantically, people were calling in, sending wires, which are just messages, asking for these stocks to be sold. But within hours, the value of companies was falling so quickly that barely anyone got something out of it that was worthwhile. This led to a number of what we call ripple effects. So, because of this, people lost faith in the US economy, thinking that the whole system was going to fall apart. And it kind of did. People ran to the banks in what we call bank runs, as you see in this picture here, and frantically tried to get their money out of the bank before the banks failed. Because everyone ran to the banks eventually ran out of money. And back then, if a bank ran out of money, that bank failed. And if you had your money left in the bank, it's gone. You can't get it back. There wasn't insurance like the FDIC protection that would give you your money back if the bank failed. So these banks had loaned out too much money. They went too much in debt. They made risky loans to people. They let people buy stocks on the margin. And when people came to get all their money out, they didn't have enough. And the bank failed. And you could just see in these pictures that we're looking at here, these lines are huge. Everyone is waiting in these big crowds trying to get into these banks, which leads to what we already talked about a little bit. People's savings accounts were just wiped out. If a bank failed, that's it. You had $100,000 in the bank, it's gone. You may have been working your whole life and saving for retirement, and it's in the bank, and if you couldn't get it out before that bank failed, that's it. So all around these countries, banks were failing, and they were failing each year of this depression. We see even in the 20s, banks were failing. But when the stock market crashes in 1929, within years, the banks are just going to keep going up for the most part, and it would continue for a few years after that. Because of this, people are going to stop buying lots of goods. One, because lots of people lost all their savings when these banks failed. Two, the economy just looks so weak with businesses devalued in the stock market that businesses quickly have to start cutting production because they realize no one's going to be buying their goods. They were already cutting production because they were overproducing goods. Goods had been overproducing, which is creating layoffs and firings. Now, even more people are going to be cut from their jobs because nobody has money anymore, or they're not willing to spend it because they think the economy is so fragile, which leads to widespread unemployment. Millions and millions of U.S. workers who were in the economy doing well during the 20s, having their best life during the 20s, all of a sudden don't have anything, don't have money, don't have savings. It was in the stock market. The stock market crashed. Tariffs that the U.S. were put on other countries caused other countries not to buy their goods as they put tariffs on their own goods. So there was a lack of trade, which just discouraged even more economic activity between countries. And if people didn't have money, more and more people who were unemployed couldn't afford their mortgages, couldn't afford their rent. Their homes were foreclosed. That means the bank is going to end up repossessing them. So people will be forced to find a place to live. They're going to end up living a lot of them will end up living in what will become known as Hoovervilles or shanty towns. So out in the fringes of the cities, on the outskirts of the big cities, in open fields, Americans are going to start building crap shacks, building shanty towns, these homeless communities made of anything they could find, scrap pieces of wood, cloth, plastic, metal, whatever they could find. You see right here, this does not look like a really good house right here. It doesn't have a door. It's made out of scrap pieces of whatever. This is millions of Americans had to live in these places all around the United States because they didn't have anywhere to live. They couldn't afford their home. They had to sell everything they could, and if that wasn't enough to keep them going, they had to move somewhere where they could survive. People are going to call these places that they have to live, these homeless communities, these shanty towns that they have to live, Hoovervilles, because the president's name was Herbert Hoover, and they blamed Hoover for not doing enough to help them, to not giving federal aid, not using the government to make sure that they didn't lose their home, that they are evicted from their apartment, from their rental home, whatever. So they're blaming President Hoover for not helping them out, not stopping them from having to live in these fields without running water, without electricity, out like in a third world country. So they'll call these places, again, Hoovervilles. And Hoovervilles could look a certain way. They could be tents out in communities. They could be tiny little shacks. They could be these big areas. Some of them weren't even in the outskirts of society, but would be literally in between the alleys, in between buildings and the alleys, as you see here. Literally just, this one has picture frames made of as part of it. Just anything they could survive in, anything they could live in to keep warm or keep shelter during rain. Some of them looked better than others, but it was a terrible experience for people. And as you can see here, you can see the city in the background, where these people are forced to flee because they had nowhere to stay, living in these junky Hoovervilles, these junky shanty towns. And if they couldn't afford a place to live, they usually couldn't afford food either. So lots of soup kitchens would be created by Catholic and Christian churches and others around the country, other charities and such, and bread lines would be made for people, and this might be your whole meal for the day, one or two of these. And the soup is very, barely has anything in it, maybe just one little tiny piece of meat, a lot of it's broth, a few veggies. You might be lucky and get some coffee or a donut someday from the bread lines. As you see here, the bread line is literally going to go around the corner to get the bread that you wanted. So things were not good for the American society, and thousands of people would begin to flee the city and would illegally ride on the trains looking for work. And these people were called hobos. A lot of people think hobos are just homeless people, but hobos originally are just people that are unemployed and are going from town to town looking for work, and they come to prominence during the Great Depression. Well, those are some really negative effects of the Great Depression. Hope you learned something. We'll talk about Herbert Hoover and how he tried to fix this next time. Thanks, guys.
Every day produce more bankruptcies, more layoffs, more people with less money in their pockets. Even U.S. Steel, a symbol of American industrial might since the turn of the century, was brought to its knees. In 3 years, the entire full-time payroll was laid off. 225,000 workers. Fearful of losing what little they had left, people rushed to the banks to withdraw their savings. But the banks, too, were short of cash. 1 year after the crash, 800 of them had failed. 9 million savings accounts were wiped out.
There was a janitor called George Gallies who had $1,000 in the Bank of the United States. It had taken Galli's 40 years to save $1,000. After spending 2 nights and 2 days in the pouring rain outside this shuttered, locked bank, literally beating on the walls with his hands in frustration, he realized he was never going to see 10 cents of his money. And he went back to the basement where he lived, and he hanged himself in despair. That's what bank failures did. They crushed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of ordinary people like George Galli's.
With their savings gone and layoffs increasing, people were forced to sell their cars, their furniture, their wedding rings. Before long, half the country's home mortgages were in default. Families across America found themselves facing eviction.